Good morning, party people, and welcome to another episode of Office Hours. Oh, good, it's even recording. I have these little buttons that I push, and automation happens, and it doesn't always happen. You know how it is in your own environment. So I'll be doing an open round of answering your questions. To get your own questions answered, go to the URL in the video description, polgab.com/room/Brento, where it's a little system built by Richie to go through and let y'all upvote questions to see who's the most popular ones. GucciRules says, "Good evening from Madrid." Oh, I wonder why it's not showing the chats correctly up here. It's not showing the chats for some reason. Don't know why that is. But good evening, and wow, it's evening already. Geez, I forget how that works. It's barely like 9:30 a.m. over in Pacific time. So let's see. The top voted question from testing123. The top voted question from testing123 says, when I'm inserting or updating data from a table, does it make sense to break up complicated select into a staging table and then load the data into the destination? Will SQL only grab exclusive locks at the end of the transaction? Your best bet for demoing this, even if your code doesn't use transactions, your best bet to demo it is to take the code that you're working with and run it in Management Studio. Type begin tran and put in the code that you're trying to work with. Don't commit it, don't roll it back, and obviously do this in a development environment, not your real production environment. Then, while different parts of your code are running, hop into another session and run sp who is active with the get locks equals 1 parameter. That way you can see the locks that are being held open. Now, the reason why I'm teaching you how to fish here, rather than giving you a fish, is that it all is going to depend on the way that you wrote your code. It's going to depend on the structures in the database. For example, if you have foreign key relationships on the data that the table that you're inserting into, that can change locking behavior. Depending on the queries that your table or the tables that you're querying can even affect it with the indexes that you have available. So really your best bet there is to type begin tran, write out your queries, and then as you're working through the entire batch, go look at those locks in another window with who is active. Jim says, good morning. Good morning to you. Always good to see you in here, Jim. So let's see, next up we have Curious DBA. Oh, and I love this question. Curious DBA says, what query tuning approach would you take to force SQL Server to do a backwards, or to do a what did he say? To do multiple backwards seeks instead of one expensive forward seek. He says, I have a composite primary key on ID and date time, and I'm trying to find the max date time for a specific ID. In order to explain this, I'm going to get out our pages from How to Think Like the Engine. If you've never seen my free How to Think Like the Engine class, you can go Google for me and SQL Server Engine over at youtube.com, or search for that at youtube.com, and you can see how it works. I'm going to use the pages from How to Think Like the Engine. Now, Stack Overflow's IDs are unique, so you just seek to any one ID and you have all the information that's available for that one ID. But you're saying that in your database design, there are multiple rows with the same ID, and you're looking for the most recent date time. And what you're asking SQL Server to do is jump to one ID and then jump to one specific date time. What SQL Server doesn't know what the last date time is, so it's got to go to the very last one inside that range and scan backwards. Scan sounds expensive, but as long as you're looking for the top one, then all you have to do is read the top one, since they're ordered by date time descending at that point. But in order to get that, you have to change your query. You can't say max. You have to say top one. Because when you say max, the way that most indexes and the way that SQL Server is going to work is that it's going to scan all of the rows for one ID and then calculate the max. Column store behavior changes that a little. But so the tuning approach there is to use top one instead of max. Even though you and I know that conceptually a top one and max are the same thing, but the SQL Server engine just isn't written that way. Next up, we have Drew asks, what are the pros and cons of using UTC time for your SQL Server? I love UTC time for my SQL servers because sooner or later you're going to get to the point where your primary SQL server is in one time zone and your disaster recovery data center is in another time zone. And when you fail over back and forth, if your database is just using date time columns and they're not specifying the time zone, you can end up with some really confusing results. So setting it to UTC prevents that. Also, you could also say that changing your data model and including the time zones would also prevent that. But I just find that most people only store one particular date time column. They don't put the time zones in, and adding time zones would require a lot of work in their application. So your disaster recovery, easier disaster recovery data is the big pro there. Next up, George says, oh, hey, Stone, thank you for the Prime subscription. I appreciate that. I should give you a nice cheer in there as well. So George asks, is it okay that when you give a caustic answer, I call you Brentward? I don't know what that means. I vaguely recall seeing some kind of meme that had something to do with Squidward. I just don't know anything about what that is. Forgive me. I'm almost 50. I don't watch cartoons anymore. I don't have a problem if you do. That's cool. Just know that I'm not going to get your 12-year-old references. Now, on the other hand, I will tell you that there's a place in Las Vegas called the Manga Hole. And I'll just leave that there. Stone says the adverts were getting too darn annoying. I know, right? Like Twitch puts in a lot of advertisements at the pre-roll, and like every 10 minutes, I think it is. It does end up seeming like a lot. On the plus side is that also pays for my cars. Woohoo! So that's totally cool. But I know exactly what you mean. I do the same thing with like all the Twitch shows that are Twitch streams that I subscribe to. I subscribe to like Spooky Loops, Bree Boss. There are several people that I subscribe to just because I want to be able to drop in and see whenever they're streaming and not have to deal with 60 seconds worth of ads. DBA Duck. Oh, hey, good to see you, DBA Duck. Ben Miller in the house. All right, next up, let's see here. We have DianaCarneiro. Diana says, I'm currently using an always-on availability group with Windows failover clustered instances. It has a few instances running on 27. Can I upgrade just one instance? Oh, you've hit one of the really big problems with failover clusters. And really anything when you run multiple instances on the same hardware. We call it instance stacking. Planning for upgrades is harder. Planning for patching is harder. Planning for availability is harder. I personally don't like instance stacking. But if you do have to instance stack, like multi-instance failover clusters, which is totally fine, I understand why people do it, then I don't want to mix versions inside the same cluster. Different versions of SQL Server can behave differently, especially since you mentioned you're using always-on availability groups. There's very different behavior between versions. What I want to do is I want to build a brand new cluster on the new version and test the daylights out of it so that I know I'm getting the behavior that I want. Because in theory, in practice, and in theory are the same. In practice, they are different. In practice, your cluster, with the janky way that you might have set it up, could have problems when it's time to fail over. I want to iron all those out ahead of time. And the way to do that is to test the bejesus out of it. You can't do that when you have other instances sharing the same hardware and you break things. So for me, a new SQL Server version means it's time for a new cluster. Next up, we have, Sid asks, What's the advantage of using sys.partitions over doing a count star? So inevitably when people are counting the number of rows in the table, they're like, why don't we just ask SQL Server? SQL Server knows. He says, we seem to be having some locking issues since sys.partitions is the same table as opposed to count star being separated. I'm not sure what you mean there. The problem is that the dynamic management views, the DMVs and system tables, don't always honor isolation level requests. You can ask SQL Server for a nolock on things like sys.partitions. You may not get it. And I know firsthand because I've had all kinds of problems with SP-Blitz and SP-Blitz index. There's a DMV that when you create an index, it takes out locks, and it doesn't matter if you say no lock or not, SP-Blitz index will be blocked by it, which then causes other queries to fail. So for me, I'm just never a fan of using the built-in system tables to get row counts. We do it in stuff like SP-Blitz index, and we have isolation level hints all over the place, but you'll notice if you go through the issues that even then we run into some blocking type issues. So for end user queries, query the tables. If you want to make a count star crazy fast, use column store indexes. Put a non-clustered column store index on there, and then it's a matter of milliseconds, no matter how large the table is. Next up, we have Mike asks, when you deploy Azure SQL Server VMs, it only shows the VM cost. What does it actually cost for the SQL Server licensing? That is up to you and your excellent negotiation skills with Microsoft. I have customers who have negotiated different costs for their enterprise agreements, and then they can leverage those up in the cloud. So your mileage may vary. Since you're here asking questions on a free Q&A on Twitch, I'm going to guess that your company doesn't have much money or leverage. Therefore, you're probably paying sticker price. Next up, Stone Tablet Monk asks, what is the best data warehouse design book for SQL Server? I have no idea. So I haven't designed a data warehouse from scratch for 2005, 17, 18 years. I haven't designed one from scratch in 18 years just because I have one of those weirdo roles where I'm kind of like an emergency room trauma surgeon for SQL Server, that I go in and resuscitate and bring servers back from the dead. So I don't get to design new things from scratch. I also don't know that there have been a lot of books written recently on data warehouses with SQL Server. Because if you listen to Microsoft, a lot of the new, and really not just Microsoft, Amazon, Google, everybody will tell you the same thing, that new modern data warehouses are moving more towards data lakes instead, where companies dump a bunch of flat files out on a file share, and then they spin up compute power whenever you want to query those file shares. That's the new way. If you're going to build a data warehouse from scratch in the year 2023, that's the way that most people are going. So in order to learn more about that, Google for modern data warehouse. It's a term that gets used by all the vendors. And Microsoft has, James Sarah has a really good video on YouTube about modern data warehouses on Azure. Next up, let's see here, depthcharge. Depthcharge says, hi, I took your Fundamentals of TempDB course and I used it to correct GAM page contention in TempDB. Is it the same for user databases? No, because the whole reason that you run into GAM and SGAM and PFS contention in TempDB is because users are constantly creating and dropping tables in TempDB. It's extremely rare that you have that same scenario in user databases. It's extremely rare that in user databases you're creating and dropping hundreds or thousands of tables per second. If you are, I would humbly suggest that you're doing it wrong. I would suggest that you're better off doing that in TempDB because that operation isn't going to affect your backups, your differentials, your change rate on storage. It doesn't have to be logged the same way. If you find yourself creating and dropping hundreds of tables a second and you think you're worried about GAM contention, refocus and just move that work over to TempDB. Gustav says, hi Brent, thanks for the awesome knowledge show. You're welcome. Always a pleasure. Have a good time doing this. Next up, we have Elad. Elad says, I have a table with identity columns as a clustered PK, only inserts and updates, table size. What can be the cause? This is the kind of really deep personal, I have a train leaving Philadelphia and a donkey aboard a cart in Omaha. When you want to get into that level of detail, that's where it helps to go to brentozar.com and click consulting up at the top of the screen. You can go from there. Now, what I will say is you're talking about fragmentation. Why don't you start by going to YouTube and searching for Brent Ozar fragmentation and then watch the videos on there, and then maybe reset your expectations about what it is that you need to focus on. Next up we have, Stone Tablet Monk asks, what are your favorite Postgres books? I don't have any. Let me tell you why. A long time ago, I switched from Windows to Mac. This was way back in 2005, 2006. I switched from Windows to Mac, and my idea was I wanted a baby step way to learn Linux. My thought was, if I got a Mac, I would slowly start learning Linux commands, and then I could move over to a real operating system, over to Linux. And what I found was that Macs were so reliable, I didn't have to worry about it. Like, I didn't have to do any troubleshooting. My Mac just worked. It's not that it's perfect. I wouldn't recommend that people running Windows would switch over to Macs, but I just didn't have to play around with it. Well, fast forward to 2017 when Richie and I were designing SQL Constant Care. I said, we're going to put it on Postgres because it's cheaper. And we're also going to put it on Amazon Aurora Postgres because they manage it for you. And I thought, okay, that's cool. I'm going to learn some stuff about Postgres and how to manage it, and I'll be able to record training classes on it and whatnot too. And you know what? It just worked. And I didn't really have to do anything with it. Aurora Postgres is magical. Now, there are a couple of edge cases, like vacuum doesn't work well for our particular circumstance. But for the most part, really just kind of works. It's just like plumbing. Now, I also have to say that I don't do any in-depth development. I have written, along with Richie, their equivalent of stored procedures and functions, which work a little bit differently, but I didn't need to read a book in order to do it. I could just take my knowledge from SQL Server and then just apply it over to that and see what the small differences in functions were. For example, you can't just declare a variable. It has to be a little more complex than that. But overall, I'd say if you're watching this show, you probably know SQL Server well enough. I don't think that you're going to need a book if you try a self-managing system like AWS Aurora Postgres. I'd totally recommend checking that out. Next up, we have GucciRules, woohoo, that says, oh, hi, Mattia, good to see you. GucciRules says, hi, Brent. In Azure SQL Managed Instances, backups are automated. Hey, Admiral, don't forget to look at the URL that's here on the screen. Azure Managed Instance backups are automated. Doesn't appear that system databases are included. Are they? And what do we need to run our own system database backups? You don't, because you're not going to be putting anything in the system databases. You shouldn't consider yourself as putting anything in master, model, MSDB, etc. Those are not for you. You put stuff in the user databases, not the system databases, and then go from there. Because it's not like you can restore system databases in Azure SQL DB managed instances either. Spitfire, hey, good to see you. Howdy, Spitfire. Next up, I love this micromanaging question. Steve says, we have a consultant who disabled CPU 0 because he had a box with 128 cores and CPU 0 was experiencing problems in VMware. The server that we're dealing with only has 8 cores, so disabling a core is a big problem for performance. Should I ask to enable that core? The techniques that you use for performance in a race car are different than the techniques that you use for performance in a minivan. I'll give you an example. In a race car, there's no air conditioning. There's no CD radio or MP3 player. There's no navigation system because you're running on a closed track. So in a race car, you take those things out in order to go faster. Now, try going to someone's minivan and saying, well, I'm a performance tuner, and all we need to do is we need to take the radio out. We need to remove air conditioning. You can sweat a little bit and we'll be fine. This minivan will go faster. That's idiotic. And furthermore, the person who tells you to do that has a fundamental misunderstanding of their audience. They are doing it wrong. And you can tell them I said that, and you can pull them back to this video to point them to it. Why are they doing it wrong? Because they spent now one CPU core flushing that licensing down the drain. That's $2,000 in Standard Edition, $7,000 in Enterprise Edition. And what you might say to the consultant is, sure, we'll disable that core, but we're going to need that to be paid for by you. We'll need you to take your fee out, but drop it by $2,000 or $7,000, and then see how quickly they change their tune. Next up, we have Porsh-uhh says, I remember hearing vaguely about issues with 2022, which negatively impacted monitoring tools. That's correct. Are there any issues with that with the release of 2022, and do they affect the first responder kit? Well, the place that you heard about that from was my blog. So if you're wondering if they're there, why would you not type that into Google along with my name and read all the stuff that I wrote for you for free and take my advice? Why would you ask me again? Because you're an idiot, frankly, but sometimes I wonder if I say those things out loud. Next up, we have Drew, who says, is SSMS query plan viewing better with one large monitor or multiple smaller monitors? What is an optimal monitor size for this? For me, it's as big as you can afford. So I can afford about a 38-inch monitor, so I have a 38-inch monitor on my desk. That's the comfortable size for me. Any bigger than that, and I start to get neck pain. But it doesn't really work as well with multiple small monitors. Your neck is on a swivel trying to move around, and SSMS doesn't spread nicely across multiple small monitors. I'm assuming that you have this question because you have large execution plans that are challenging to troubleshoot. One friend of mine even has a 38-inch monitor, and it has it on a pivot so he can rotate it sideways, and that way he can see more of like long stored procedures, and I kind of like that trick too. Jim says he's watching on my 65-inch TV. That's a nice way to do it as well. And Nick's probably like zoomed out so far. He's looking at it with binoculars. Or Jim, I mean. Let's see here. Next up. Phineas asks, what are your thoughts about manually clearing SQL wait stats? Should this ever be done? No. Never. Period. Full stop. What you want to do is you want to see the wait stats over a sample of time. That's what tools like SP Blitz first are for. They'll take a sample over a period of time. They just record the beginning numbers, record the numbers at the end, and subtract them. You're an adult now. Subtraction isn't hard. If it is hard, you're in the wrong business. I personally never clear wait stats, and I get really pissed off when people do. Next up, we have the Fall Guy. The Fall Guy says, how do you decide when to store data as JSON blobs versus storing data in a well-defined schema? Oh, it's a great question. The time to store JSON blob data, there are people out there who are going to be like, Brent's going to say never. No, there's a really good time for it. When you would never need to query it relationally. When all you have to do is shove the data into SQL Server, and then you're always going to get the whole thing back out. And then you're going to operate on that thing application side-wise. But if it's just one blob that you would never break up into pieces because you need just one part out of it, then sure, store the whole thing in there as one JSON blob. Have like a key value. I want the session state for user ID 1234, and then you get the whole JSON blob back. Because it's not like you're going to do with anything with session state as part of a T-SQL statement in the database. It exists only so that you can grab the whole thing out. Next up, TE asks, hi, Ozar. It's Mr., but okay, I'm not a doctorate, but last name, it seems kind of odd to call me that. Hi, Ersoy. We've enabled CDC in SQL Server. After a while, the log file gets too big and we couldn't shrink it. When CDC is open, it pulls the log status. How do we implement a solution? So I've never troubleshooted that myself with CDC. My guess is you don't have something configured right, but that's just a guess. This is a good example of something to post on Stack Exchange. I would go to dba.stackexchange.com just because CDC is one of those kind of edge case technologies where there aren't a lot of people using it. So for that, you want to get a really big, wide audience of people who might answer the question and put as much detail in there as you can, like output of, how often do you run log backups too would be interesting for this one. But I would start there. dba.stackexchange.com. Next up, Dance Monkey says, is it reasonable to update stats with full scan as the first job step before running the next job step that does work on a very large data warehouse fact table? Okay, so with data warehouse fact tables, typically the way that they're loaded is overnight you load a whole bunch of stuff with yesterday's sales. So it's Thursday night. Thursday night, you have the close of business, and overnight, you load everything in there with Thursday sales. And then what do people go and do? They query Thursday sales. A classic problem with data warehouses is they have something called the ascending key problem, where if you're querying the tail end of the data, SQL Server doesn't make good estimates on the number of rows. So, someone in your shop probably had the idea to update stats and scan the whole entire object so you could see last night's sales before you run queries. That is one solution. If you have the time to do it, that's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. But what you probably want to look at is the ascending key problem. Search for SQL Server ascending key problem, and then that way you can get all kinds of other solutions to it, like building fake statistics out for the future, trying to get SQL Server to recognize that it's an ascending key, and then it'll treat statistics differently as well. But a lot of times it's just me saying those words, SQL Server ascending key problem, and then it opens up a whole new world. It's like parameter sniffing. Once you know what those two words are, all of a sudden you're like, oh, that's what it's called. There's all kinds of articles on how to fix it. GucciRules, thanks for the subscription. I appreciate it. Matthias says, what alternatives have you seen in the real world about change data capture? Far and away, the number one alternative is you put a date stamp column on the table. You add a column for last updated date, and you don't even have to change the application. You just maintain it with a trigger so that whenever the row's inserted, it has the current date time, and whenever it's updated, it has the old date time, and then you have a delete trigger that whenever rows are deleted, they're moved into an archive table along with that update date time. Then in your ETL application, you just query for whatever the high watermark was for dates, the last time that you processed. So I need everything that happened since yesterday at 3 p.m., and then you can get just those rows. That way you don't have to add any SQL Server features in there in order to get it. And then one other question here we have in the queue. Kevin says, is the order of rows guaranteed when inserting them into a transaction? The app sends row 1 and 2 with their own creation date set in the app, but row 2 has an earlier date. Okay, what I think is happening here, based on your description, is that when you say row 1 and row 2, I think you mean identity columns. Like you're saying, insert this row and this row. Then when you query them back, the ones with different dates have different identity numbers. Well, if you're inserting them inside the same insert statement, it's an absolute guess as to which ones are going to go first. There's no guarantee. If you're doing insert this row with an old date, then in a separate statement, insert this row with another date, commit, they should be in order. The only thing that I'm worried about is I think you're really only using one insert statement, or it's possible that you're using sequences too. If you're using sequences, I'd be curious as to how your application is assigning those rows, but that's the place where I would start to go check. Oh, there's another question that came in from Shift Happens. Hi, Brent. 99% of the time, I don't need to do any SQL tuning. There are times when they come these really complicated procs when perf is bad, and I try my best to tune, but I'm not the best. Any advice on how I can get better at it? I wonder if there's anyone online who offers training classes to help you get better. And I wonder if they might also offer consulting to help do that work for you. Do you know anyone that might be? Gosh, I just don't know. I'm not sure. Maybe one of the 55 people who are currently watching this webcast might be able to give you a hint of someone who might offer services like that. I wonder if there's any names that are up on the screen, perhaps. Nah, we'll probably never know. Thus concludes another entertaining and informative office hours. You know, it's really funny when I jokingly talk with my other blogger and presenter friends. There are these different stages in your career. The beginning of the career, when you first start blogging and streaming and doing videos, you're like, I wish someone would watch and read my stuff and leave me a comment. And then over time, people do start leaving comments and interacting with you on Twitch and things like that. And you're like, oh my God, this is amazing. It's fantastic. And then later on in your career, you're like, I wish people wouldn't ever say anything. Because all it takes is that one of those questions where you're like, oh, my day is now terrible. VTech Fred says, too funny. Oh, Dawn's Early Light. I love the way you wrote your name, Dawn's Early Light. That's so awesome. That's like a drag queen name. Dawn's Early Light says, can you explain the lights? And I assume you mean these, not these over here. This is just the Las Vegas sign. But this is an everyday calendar by Simone Yetch. Simone Yetch was the queen of crappy robots over on YouTube. But this everyday calendar, whenever I write 2 days worth or write 2 pages worth of training class material, I touch that button and it lights up that particular day. I'm actually running behind. I haven't been good about updating this because I have been writing training. And in fact, I wrote training this morning, so I should push the button for January 23rd just so that lights up and I keep track of that. But I absolutely love it. It's fantastic. It's a little visual reminder for me to keep up with a habit. Some people use it for yoga. Some people use it for meditation, things like that. Tom in York says, hi, Brent. Thanks for the answer on the last stream. You are welcome. So I am off today. We are flying to Chicago tomorrow. Eve and I are flying to Chicago to go spend a couple days in the big city and then drive up to Michigan to see my family. My dad's side of the family's over in West Michigan. So we'll head over there and spend like a week. So I don't think I'm going to be doing any live streaming. I think I'll just record stuff. I'll bring my video gear and sound gear to record while I'm up there. So I'll do disconnected office hours like I've done in the past when I go through and travel. I realized I hadn't done that a lot lately. DBA Duck says, could you share how to get that calendar? If you search for Everyday Calendar Simone, she has because her last name's hard to write, Everyday Calendar Simone, and she has an online store. It's also in the Museum of Modern Art. Matthias says, are you still playing DBD? Yes, I played last night for probably 8 hours. I love Dead by Daylight. It's absolutely fantastic. And I keep meaning to set up a camera in my home theaters right on the other side of this camera. There's like a wall, and then right on the other side, I've got my home theater. I have a 150-inch screen with a laser projector, surround sound, like multiple rows of couches. And I keep meaning to set up a camera and do streaming in there. I've even got a gaming PC set up in there so that we can do streaming. So one of these days I'll start streaming playing Dead by Daylight again. I did it briefly when I lived down in Mexico, and I had a really good time with it. I am not talented enough that I can stream and talk very well at the same time. And I'm super competitive, so when I play DBD, I'm usually really hyper-focused on the game. But it'll be fun for you to fun for some of you. And not everybody loves Twitch. I love watching Twitch. I love watching people play games on Twitch. Nick says, would that be in the same channel? That would be in the same one. Yes, I'll just do it all in one in here. I'm not very professional, as you longtime viewers can probably attest. I'll just do it all inside the same channel. All right, well, thanks for hanging out with me today, and I will see y'all on the next office hours. Adios.